Hello and welcome to the Stone and Chalk webinar event, Reshaping the Future of Accounting with ChatGPT. We're about to start now. So Ben Dunn, our AI expert here at Stone and Chalk, over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Blake. Okay, so I have you for an hour today. What we're going to be doing is, hopefully I can keep to 45 minutes talking and then allow 15 minutes Q&A. But last time I got to 54 minutes because I have a lot of slides to go through. So we will see how we go, but I will try. So just a quick mention of Stone and Chalk, which is where I work. We are a co-working space and innovation ecosystem business that started off in 2014. We were set up to encourage fintechs in Australia, but since then we have expanded across more than 40 different emerging technology areas. I work in the advisory team. We work with corporates of all sizes to help them to innovate more effectively. So this moment was made for us. On the chat is going to be my colleague, Kim. And so you can ask her questions all the way through and she will hopefully answer them or at least put them to me towards the end for the Q&A. So in terms of the Stone and Chalk advisory team, what we help companies to do is to leverage tech disruption or leverage tech for disruption, innovate for growth. And we also partner with startups and help corporates to partner with startups because we have access to more than 4,000 startups and founders across Australia. So if you're wanting to know more about any of those things that we do, you can email me at that address or you can email Kim there. I should also say that in terms of this presentation, we will be posting it on YouTube afterwards. So you'll have access to the slides that you're seeing after that point. So I think we've all been in meetings like this, and I think generative AI really has kind of taken everybody sideways, and some of the largest tech companies in the world are no exception. I see generative AI a little bit like the opposite of a wasp, in the sense that they always say that if you ignore it, it won't sting you. If you ignore generative AI, it really will sting you. But fortunately, if you do embrace it, take notice of it, I think there's some enormous opportunities. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So key messages, and this is how I've structured the presentation overall. Firstly, generative AI changes the way we work at a fundamental level, and the way that we use GPT operationally in our kind of everyday work will make a massive difference to the impact on you as an individual, but also your business. Secondly, generative AI should lead to better accountants. I did a seminar just recently for lawyers. That was a very, very different feel because there's a lot of stuff in the press about how generative AI is going to impact lawyers, especially junior lawyers. We actually disagree. We think there's much more of an opportunity for lawyers around a concept called induced demand, which I'll take you through too. But I think in terms of generative AI for accountants, certainly our view is that it looks almost entirely positive, and we will kind of I will walk you through the reasons why we think that. And then lastly, significant opportunities available for early adopters. There's lots of kind of fuss in the press, lots of things about how fast things are moving. The riches are going to go to the people who get going with something. And again, we're going to talk about that towards the end of the presentation. So first of all, a bit of good news. This thing is built for normal people. That means you don't need to understand code. You don't need to do if this, then that statements. All you need to do is talk in normal language, conversational language. It's not even as hard as Google. So this is built for normal people, and that's its strength, but also in a sense, its threat, because that means it is available to everybody on the planet. Secondly, there's a lot of stuff in the press around, the dangers of AI, and there is certainly risks involved. But if you're an Iron Man fan like me, think Jarvis, not Skynet. This is something which should be elevating you, and it's not cheating. That's something I come across quite a lot with people, is that they feel like even if they did use GPT, they don't really want to tell me because I might think that they're cheating in some way. This is Jarvis. This is helping you. This is elevating you. And we'll talk about that. Think of this as the rising tide that floats all boats. So that means that if you're not using it and everybody else is, you're drowning. So be on the boat. Don't be out of the boat. We'll talk about that and Superman a little bit later. Now, part of the reason why there's been all this fuss over ChatGPT is just its sheer rate of adoption when you compare it with something like Instagram or Spotify. And so why is that? Fundamentally, it's because there's no infrastructure needed for this thing that hasn't been built already. So there's no pipes, there's no wires, you don't have to buy a device. Anybody with a smartphone and a data contract can access this thing. And that means that 6.6 billion people on the planet, in theory, who have smartphones have access to this thing. So it really is genuinely everything, everywhere, all at once. It doesn't care what language you speak. It doesn't care what class you are. It doesn't care what educational level you have. This is democratizing expertise in a very real way. Something that certainly generative AI in this generation has kind of changed. Previously, I was working at a small startup called Daisy that used artificial intelligence to help contact centers and compliance. And at that time, one of the things that we were sort of wrestling with was that difference between unstructured data, like audio, for instance, and structured data, like spreadsheets. And AI much preferred the structured kind. And we spent a lot of time taking unstructured data and turning it into the structured kind. That's still an issue, but nowhere near as an issue as it used to be. Now, things like ChatGPT can take the data and structure it itself. So it doesn't have to be something which is all in spreadsheets, okay? There's also some very real research that shows exactly how more productive people are with AI. And you may have heard about radiologists and looking at X-rays. Given how many X-rays there are in the world, that should be a fairly obvious application of AI. But what they've found is that the AI can spot something in 92% of cases by itself, humans in 90% of cases, but together, 99% of cases. So AI is something that works better with humans and vice versa. Skeuomorphism is a concept that I first heard about in a podcast with a guy called Chris Dixon, who's a partner at Andreessen Horowitz. And basically, skeuomorphism is where you apply a new technology in an old way. You've taken a new technology and you've not questioned the assumption. So this is a picture that I asked Midjourney to build for me, because essentially when broadcast TV came about, they started by pointing broadcast cameras on a fixed tripod at a stage, and then they would, the actors would come out and they would do their thing, because they hadn't questioned that assumption of moving the tripod around or zooming or any of the things that we just could take for granted now in terms of the camera. Similarly, when broadcast radio started, they would sit there and they would read the newspaper over the radio. So the present day example with ChatGPT would be, when you first go into ChatGPT, usually people put in a prompt that looks a lot like a Google search. And ChatGPT is not a Google search. So we're going to go through some examples of prompts later on. But that concept of skeuomorphism is really important to overcome, to kind of catch yourself not questioning the assumptions as to exactly how you could use this in new ways. What else does this help you to do? There was some research that Goldman Sachs sent out back in, I think it was March time. There was a lot of fuss in the Financial Times. And it showed that 1/4 of current work tasks will be automated by AI in the US and Europe. One of the issues that I think with the way that this was reported is that they talked about impact. And impact in that sense sounds very negative. The fact is, there's a lot to be said for automating tasks with AI. And there's an argument that AI won't actually take anybody's jobs, but it might actually take people tasks that are part of people's jobs. And yes, if that task that AI can do really well is your entire job, you're in trouble. But the point is, how can you use AI in combination with what you do normally to get better. So this is a great quote from IBM. AI might not replace managers, but the managers that use AI will replace the managers that do not. And therefore, understanding how this works, and as I said, it's built for normal people. It's not built for people who code, who are great people too, but you know what I mean. The point is, everybody has access to this. So if you're not using it, you're at a significant disadvantage to everybody who is. And this is another one from the Financial Times. Productivity gains from AI will be earned by whoever has the wits or motivation to deploy them. This is something I'm going to come back to in the third section, but this is all about doing something, getting out there. You don't have to kind of create a startup. You don't even have to create your own large language model. But the point is, this should be something that you're using for every email you send, every time you need another idea. GPT should be your first visit, or the generative AI application of your choice. So these are the kind of things that AI can help any company to do, whether it's routine volume, summarizing training. We'll come to this a little bit later. But fundamentally, what it does is it solves a blank page so that when you're kind of wanting to write a blog post or any of those kind of things, you can go to GPT first and it will give you some ideas. There's a friend of mine who's an anesthetist. He puts in the details of the case, obviously not the name of the patient or anything, puts in the details of the case and asks it for ideas as to how he might do the anesthetic. So these generative AI is being used everywhere to do that sort of thing, to just give you inspiration. It's not going to get it right all the time, but it might produce something that you haven't thought of, and that's really cool. Benedict Evans is one of my favorite writers in this area. And he made a really good point on Twitter, which large language models do not answer questions. They create things that look like answers to questions, that look like your question. Now, the key here is that at the end of the day, the generative AI is a prediction model. What it's trying to do is to predict what the next word is in the sentence. What it is not doing is interrogating a database unless you provide the database. So one of the things I want to demonstrate later is the code interpreter. And in that case, you're uploading a spreadsheet, and then the AI model is interrogating that spreadsheet and coming back to you with kind of different pieces of information. That's okay. In any other situation, be really, really careful when it starts talking about facts. So, for instance, one of the big issues that you read about is that you can't tell what the sources are for something. And you can ask ChatGPT what its sources are, and it will respond. But it will tell you what it thinks looks like the right source. So in that way, it's very similar to my 5-year-old. When he has done something wrong and I ask him who did it, he gives me an answer which sounds plausible. And that's what ChatGPT does. So be really careful when you're dealing with facts. So what does that mean? What can't AI do? And it's the kind of things that you would expect. Everything that humans can do, it struggles with. So in terms of judgment, emotional intelligence, understanding and interpreting ambiguity, which from my experience with accountants is a really big value add from the accountants that I've used in the past. These things are not cut and dried. These things are open to interpretation. And therefore, it's really important that you understand that's something that GPT cannot do. But there's a kind of a caveat to that. Whoops. Yet. AI is changing all the time. It's getting better all the time. And so whilst it can't do all of these things at the moment, it's getting better. I can't see that poll on my screen. So how should you use GPT? At the moment, before we've got to the yet stage, it's very much using it like you would an intern. And what that means is you have to give it a full brief, a tight brief in terms of what you're looking for. And it will come back to you with something. You can then and should give it feedback if it's not exactly what you're looking for, because it will, unlike Google, it will remember what you briefed it with at the beginning. So you can have a conversation that goes, yeah, kind of like that, but yellow, or kind of like that, or tell me more about option 3. Give me more options for this in the big list. Okay. So in terms of an intern, you need to teach it, but you can give it feedback and then it will try again. And that's the level it's at the moment. So secondly, generative AI should lead to better accountants. This is what GPT looks like today. One of the issues with doing a webinar like this is that I don't really know what level everybody's at. So I'm sure some of you are GPT experts and you're using it every day, and there'll be other people who've never seen it in their lives before. So this is what GPT looks like today. And the competition is multiplying all the time. ChatGPT is where it started. Clearly, we have the thing from Google and Bing Chat. What's interesting is if you look at the line at the bottom there around key features, all of them are doing what marketers would love them to do, which is to identify a differentiator that they can position themselves around. What was interesting the other day is that Anthropic, you can see attachment size is one of those rows there. Their differentiator, or one of them, is that you can upload really, really large documents into Anthropic in a way that you cannot with the others. So I wanted to put this up just to say there's other things that you can use. And if you want to access GPT-4, but you don't want to pay the $35 subscription, you can access that through Perplexity, which is an app on the phone, but it's also on the browser, or through Bing Chat. So there's all sorts of different ways to access GPT-4, and that's only increasing. I was listening to a podcast recently with a lady from Microsoft who works in their future of work team, and she was talking about the way in which they are integrating GPT into all of their applications. And she talked about Teams. Now, I realize this is Zoom, but if you imagine what she said is that they are taking a call like this, and I've called it Jarvis in my top right-hand corner there. But the generative AI will listen to the meeting, and through the meeting, as a result of what's being said live, it will provide different suggestions, reminders of things about an email, for instance. It might go off and it might find research and come back with something that's relevant. It might even talk about Alan doesn't seem very happy with you based on his tone and body language, so sentiment analysis. But it can also coach you. So all of this sort of thing is done in the moment, within the meeting. So if you can imagine being in a meeting with a whole bunch of people and all of them have this on, you don't want to be the person without it on, because this, with any luck, should lead to not only better meetings, but also you can imagine if you're somebody who's junior and is learning, this type of thing is invaluable. So it is aware, it's proactive, it's in the moment. It's at the moment, you have to go to GPT, you have to put in a prompt and then come back. And that's going to change very, very soon. I'm sure we've all wanted this, a key on the keyboard that just says brilliance, and you press that and out comes the insight. That moment has come. This is something that I use with the lawyers, and I believe this is kind of similar with actually any business, but accountants will be no exception. Apprenticeship is really expensive, and clearly you have a period of time where somebody is just learning, and the dotted line there represents the training cost. But it's all right because you're investing that amount of money in the apprentices, and therefore the amount of value that they deliver increases over time. But that means that it's really expensive. There's a huge amount of money that's invested in that. But now think back to the Jarvis example in Teams. Now you've got something where it can provide personal and detailed feedback on the work that somebody's doing, much more personal and detailed than they get right now from, on an everyday basis, even though there will be people in the firm, I'm sure, who are there to mentor them or coach. You don't have to be a part of that anymore. It can even objectively rate an individual relative to their peers. So, for instance, if somebody just isn't cut out for accounting, that they can know that much sooner than they would right now. So that means that generative AI can reduce costs and increase the point at which somebody becomes revenue generating much faster and in a much more detailed way than is possible today. So that means that training and feedback is going to be as hyper-personalized as propositions will also be as a result of AI, because now we can generate all of this sort of stuff based on an individual's particular challenges and needs. That has a big impact on the talent curve, because right now we're all familiar with the idea of the kind of the normally distributed curve, and the top performers are the people who are responding well to the training. They tend to have a kind of a natural talent to it. But now we're introducing something which kind of helps with that. So all of a sudden, the rest of the bell curve moves to the right. So that means that in terms of kind of the way that talent acts, what we're doing is turning people into a room full of supermen. And I don't know if you remember the Pixar film, The Incredibles, but there's that character there who says, you know, if everybody has superpowers, then nobody does. So what's happening now is that that kind of training from generative AI, if that is shifting the bell curve all to the right, and you're not part of that kind of as a firm or as an individual, and if you're not constantly learning as time goes on, you're lost. Or conceivably, we could be looking at much more of a kind of a Marvel universe where instead of everybody having exactly the same talents in a room full of supermen, it could be that what we're dealing with is people who have a diversity of talents, because what they can do now, because of that rising tide that floats all boats, everybody now has a very similar level of base expertise upon which they can now bring their particular flavor, what their style, whatever it is that they're going to bring to accounting. So GPT fundamentally changes that model conceivably, where apprenticeship is much shorter, the training cost comes right down, but the delivered value becomes much greater. So the question is, would that result in accountancy generating more individual accountants than people who are necessarily within firms? So I think there's certain kind of professions like dentists or driving instructors or hairdressers where solopreneurship, running their own business, is kind of inevitable. That's kind of the career path, because why would you work for someone else and give them a portion of the money that you're earning if you could go out and do it by yourself? Now, when you're starting out, you do need the training, you do need the brand, the business development, all of those kind of infrastructures. But at the point when you don't need that anymore, then it becomes obvious to kind of go out and go by yourself. So does that mean that generative AI may well result in many more individuals with these skills than people who feel the need to be within a company? So let's talk about prompts. I'll just get rid of this poll off my screen. There we go. So a prompt is not Google, as I said earlier. This is not just kind of one or two words. The idea with a prompt is that you're giving them the brief in the same way as that you would give it to a brief to an intern. So typical prompt, the length, the topic, the structure, the style. Prompts have actually come a long way since then. So I need to replace this slide. But my point is, it's not the kind of thing that you would put in Google. When you think about generative AI, though, the other point is that when you come to something like GPT, all you get is that letterbox. It doesn't give you any other clues. And I am sure that you have heard of things that you can do, like you can get it to write emails for you, summarize, do all sorts of things. But there's fantastic things that people are getting GPT to do, and no one told them to do it. They just learned over time and they just tried out different things. So I'm going to show you some examples of the imagine part, because I think that's the most exciting part of this. but there's still the kind of the operational side where you want it to explain a concept or write an email or do some or convert something. Those are just as valuable, but the imagine thing I think is really exciting. So just because you have access to a typewriter, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll become Ernest Hemingway. You could even buy Ernest Hemingway's typewriter and you still won't write like him. So it's exactly the same with GPT, is that everybody, those 6.6 billion people on the planet with a smartphone, all have access to that same tool. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to apply it in the same way and make the same amount of, or derive the same amount of benefit from it. So something I did recently, at Stone and Chalk, we have a purpose, which is that we are here to transform Australia into a sustainable technology-driven economy. And so I was playing around with GPT and I thought, I wonder if it could take that vision, that purpose, and tell me what Australia looks like once it is a sustainable technology-driven economy. And so that's the response that you see on the right-hand side. Because one of the things that I always struggle with in any business is, you know, when you have a vision statement or a purpose statement, actually kind of imagining what that will look like when it comes to pass tends to be really hard. Plus, something that we talk about at Stone and Chalk is that steel thread, which is there needs to be a congruence between the vision and then everything else that a company does through the strategy, through the tactics. And sometimes that's, if it exists, that's not very obvious. So what I did after I got it to describe the future, I then asked it to kind of walk backwards through the time machine and describe the role that Stone and Chalk played in creating and driving that future. And it did. It gave me everything. It played along, you know, in terms of the story. And it said, well, you know, Stone and Chalk is this. And therefore what it did was these things. And then I said, and in terms of that, what strategy did Stone and Chalk follow? But I said between 2023 and 2026, because I wanted to kind of, you know, bring it back to present day. And then I asked it, and what organizational structure did Stone and Chalk put in place in order to deliver that strategy? And I could continue, right? I could then say, okay, and now give me job descriptions for these people. Give me OKRs, goals for all of these people. So you can imagine from that one statement of transforming Australia into a sustainable tech-driven economy, all of these things become possible. One of the things that I did this morning was to say, I need you to help me to imagine an AI-based accounting services company. And I want you to organize this in the format of a business model canvas. And so I gave it the business detail of AI-based accounting services company called Dunn & Co. And on the right-hand side, you can see this is what it came out with. But then I also wanted it to give me startup ideas in terms of kind of accounting services using generative AI. So I asked it what it would do for that. And you can see it actually gave me 4 different ideas, but this is where it started. In different decks, I've then taken this type of thing and then said, tell me what the project plan looks like. Tell me what the structure looks like. Tell me who I should hire first. Tell me what I should pay them. And the problem with, of course, with saying, tell me what I should pay them, is that that gets dangerously close to facts. So we need to stay away from that, particularly with pay. So then I asked it, give me some advertising ideas, you know, give me some metaphors that I could use to describe this accounting firm. And there's some choice ones in there, like Profit's personal bodyguard. I think it probably went a little bit far, but it's trying. Something that I also think is really useful for people like me is taking something, a complex accounting concept and explain it to me as if I was a 5-year-old. And you can see that's what it's done there. But then later explain it as if I was an accountancy student. So we're back to that training, right? That thing that works really well in terms of reducing the time of apprenticeship. But then I can say summarize and do that in 100 words. And it does the same thing. So in terms of prompts can be quite confronting because, like I said, you just have that letterbox. But the good news is GPT can help you to build the prompt itself. So this is what you would write in. I want you to help me create a great prompt so that you can provide the best output for me. I'd like you to execute the following steps, and this is what you ask it to do. So you can actually ask it what prompt you should be asking it, you should be putting in to prompt it. A couple of months ago, there was a guy who came up with this idea of auto GPT. And there's several apps out there that do this, where you put in a goal and you can see, how can Australia be transformed into a tech-driven economy? By the way, we do know the answer to this, right? I'm not asking the AI all the time, but it's a good thing. And therefore, you can see here on the right-hand side, what it's done is to kind of break down that goal. And on the right-hand side, you've got the current tasks, because what it's done is to say, okay, if that's the goal, these are the individual tasks that I should then break that initial goal down into. And then in the center there, you can see embarking on a new goal, and it's showing you it's working. It's showing you in terms of where it's going next, what it's doing. It's going off and searching. It comes back with the answer, and so on. So there are significant opportunities available to early adopters. This is one of my favorite guys from the 19th century, because everybody needs a favorite guy from the 19th century. He invented or came up with the same way for an aircraft to take off as the Wright brothers, only he did it 40 years earlier. And his big challenge was that he only had steam engines available to him at the time. So it was only when the internal combustion engine came along, and that was available to the Wright brothers, that they could do their thing. The reason I put this up is that sometimes what it needs is an emerging technology to come along in order to unlock something new. So you have to kind of be aware as to what those emerging technologies look like, because that can then unlock new business models, new ways of doing business, new ways of making money. So business model innovation is something that we in the advisory team work on quite a lot, looking at new technology and how that might make a difference to the way that a business model is set up right now. And I just wanted to talk about induced demand. So this is a concept where the fact that there is more supply of something actually means that there is an increase of the demand for that good. So the best example is, you know, whenever they add more lanes to a motorway, there just seems to be more cars that come from nowhere to use that lane in the motorway. And so, as in this example, we just keep on building lanes, but there's still traffic. So you could see an induced demand in terms of the introduction of a new technology like generative AI. And I use this with the lawyers to say, it could be that if I can do law myself, I might use the law more often. I might sue my neighbor because his tree's coming over into my garden, but I wouldn't have necessarily done that if I had to pay for it and if I couldn't do it myself. So what does that mean? That could mean that there is a big difference between the current demand for services that you see right now and the latent if-only demand. If only I had access to something that could do legal advice for me, then I would use that. And so you could see that there is the potential for what you might call the commercial dream. So at the moment, for many professional services businesses, you might have a volume business. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that's preparing people's tax. And at the moment, that's a person who actually serves that volume business, which then means that that's quite low margin in terms of a volume business. But what you're hoping for is that it goes up to the more high margin insight and advice business at the top, in terms of kind of taking something that's a particularly complex tax return, and that needs the higher order stuff. So ideally what we would like to do is to move from this kind of model to this, whereby you might have a product that enables people to do a tax return themselves, so DIY accountants. And that product could be your product. And because it's a tech product and it's not involving a human at that stage, at that volume stage, what you end up with is something which is actually high margin volume. And that the number of people who would then take that tax return, if they get into trouble with the tax return itself, it's too complex, they've got a difficult question that the software can't deal with, that's the point at which it upsells to the human beings, the people, the accountants who've got the kind of the higher order knowledge, in which case you're increasing the amount of high margin insight and advice. So what you could end up with is a lower cost to serve. You're able to access higher volumes and therefore new markets at lower cost. You've got a clear upsell funnel from the volume through to the higher end servicing, and that you've got a higher volume of that kind of business overall. So how might we start with that? So where we are at the moment is we have a general AI model in ChatGPT and all of the others that I showed you on that table earlier, and that represents a natural language UI user interface. But what's happening now? A couple of months ago, Bloomberg released Bloomberg GPT, and Bloomberg GPT is just trained on Bloomberg data. So it's a large language model for finance. And there's other models out there which are equally trained on a specific area of expertise, like the Google Med Palm 2, which is specifically trained on medical exam questions. So if you were to ask the same medical exam questions to GPT, the pass mark, it gets 50.2%, but the Google Med Palm 2 gets 85.4, which is 25.4% above what the approximate medical pass mark is right now. So when you've got a model which is specifically trained on a subject area, whether it's finance or medicine or tax, it performs much, much better than the general model. So over time, we're going to see more and more models like that based on data, but it gets better than that, because now there's all sorts of software and companies coming out which enable you as an individual or as a company to build your own GPT based on your data. And so that then becomes a hyperlocal AI model on top of a specific model. So there's a big difference between the tax in the US. Clearly, there's a big difference between tax in the US and tax in Australia. So tax GPT as a specific AI model needs something hyperlocal on top of that. Now, something that ChatGPT released back in March was kind of like the version of their app store, but it's these plugins. And the plugins, basically what they do, they are these things called APIs, which open a tunnel for GPT to reach through to a database and pull information based on the prompts that you've asked it, and pull that information back into GPT, and then use it, combine it with other things in order to provide your answer. So that might be, for instance, it might be a travel itinerary, in which case you might say, I need to go somewhere hot for a week, and my budget is $3,000. In which case it will use Kayak in combination with Expedia to go out and find options and come back to you with an itinerary, and press this button to buy. Now, that is kind of a problem for the likes of Expedia and Kayak, because no one's going to their websites anymore. So one of the strategic decisions that people like Expedia and Kayak have to do is to say, are we okay with giving up our traffic to ChatGPT? Or should we be doing our own large language models? Now, a commercial option for accountants would be to create your own plugins for ChatGPT. And again, back to my triangle, back to my pyramid, that could well become the volume that then upsells into more value-added services at the top. It's an option. So what you're doing is making the data more available through an API layer. And then there's applications like Otter, Now, I use Otter for transcribing meetings, and it's excellent in terms of the transcription quality. And it uses AI to do that, obviously, for the transcription. So that final layer right at the top, which makes it really easy to use and really easy to access, is something like Otter, which is then on your phone, on your browser, and then that comes into things like Zoom, and it comes into Teams, and that makes it really easy to use. So, fundamentally, there's this guy on Twitter, to replace accountants with AI, clients will need to send their files on time and accurate records, so accountants are safe. And you can see his point. So the question then becomes, well, where does the commercial value go in terms of generative AI? Because when I'm talking to the lawyers, their big fear is that what generative AI will create is lots of DIY lawyers who can put in, neighbor, tree, over fence, write me a letter, solicitor's letter, and it will do that. But as we know, as I said, when I was talking about Benedict Evans, it won't actually write a legal letter. What it will write is something that looks like it could be a legal letter, because it's all done based on probabilities and prediction. So I think where the value is going to go in terms of the accountancy is going to be much more on that right-hand side in terms of accountants as a business than it is necessarily on the left-hand side in terms of customers doing it themselves. Now, I realize that there is a very wide number of customer segments that accountants address. So this is in a very kind of business to consumer type of kind of dimension. But I'm having to make assumptions based on what I think the audience is. So if we look at accountants on the right-hand side as a business, what does that mean in terms of what can generative AI do for new businesses, but also introducing you to volume markets where you can service those at a much lower cost? And you can imagine creating that digital product becomes really attractive, but there is the Sven problem. So there is a marketing professor called Mark Ritson, and he lives down in Tasmania, and he had this great story about Sven. And basically what the Sven problem is that his wife did yoga, but they lived in the middle of Tasmania. There was only two options of teachers, and there was Sven and someone else. And so they chose Sven. Sven used to come to the house and do his yoga thing. And then COVID came along. And so Sven couldn't do that anymore. So he wrote to all of his clients and he said, I'm going to do yoga over Zoom. So that was great. They just did it with Sven over Zoom. COVID then went away, and Sven discovered that the worst part of his day was driving between his different customers. So what he did was to write to everybody and say, I'm not going to come to your house anymore. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to do it on Zoom. But the problem is that Mark's wife started to look for other yoga teachers who also did yoga over Zoom. And she realized there was this whole world of people out there who did yoga on Zoom who were cheaper and better than Sven. So my point here is that by all means, create a DIY product, but realize that that makes a big, big difference to your competitive set, just like Sven. So something I wanted to show you just now, there is a thing that OpenAI released, which is called a code interpreter. And I'm not going to make you go through everything rather painfully, but what it's just done, the user has uploaded a spreadsheet called just untitled. And so immediately what it does is it looks at the spreadsheet and it comes back and it says, this contains data on the music market revenues in various countries and regions. And then what it does is it creates the columns in the data, right? It's just giving you a list of what that is. And so later, you can see the prompt at the bottom. I'd like to cluster that data. I want to find clusters that are attractive to our business. So the code interpreter goes off and looks for the cluster in that data. That's all of the instruction that it's been given, okay, based on the spreadsheet that was uploaded. So then it thinks about it. You can see it's coming back. These are the things that it would use to cluster the data. But if we keep on going, this is it showing it's working and it's thinking. And then underneath, what it does, there we go, clustered into 3 groups, right? So here are the clusters that it's identified within the spreadsheet. Based on average values, all of the features I talked about, these are the clusters. But that wasn't enough for the guy with the prompt. So what he said was, you've got to give it more friendly titles, right? I'd like a higher resolution view, perhaps 5 clusters rather than the 3 that it's given you. But I also want more friendly titles, and I want to understand what strategies somebody might pursue. So give it a catchy name. So then it goes off, it does its work. This is all based on that kind of untitled spreadsheet that he gave it. No other instructions, just straight in. Go. So here we go. It's describing the clusters it's found. But then the guy says, in terms of those prompts, tell me what strategies I might employ in terms of actually kind of addressing that. Please write a strategy for a company. Yeah, that's a bit painful. Looking to grow its business. So there you are. So all of this based on that initial spreadsheet. And so you can imagine whatever spreadsheet you're putting into the code interpreter, all of a sudden, you're able to have a conversation with that spreadsheet. And you can then ask the spreadsheet things. And back to what I was saying earlier about it doesn't care whether it's structured or unstructured data. Obviously, this is kind of structured data, but it's able to look at it and understand the data and then provide kind of insights from there. So these are just kind of examples of other AI applications which are out there, which do things like help people to invest. There's Sheets Plus, which helps you look for formulas and uses AI within Google Sheets and Excel. Blue Jay Tax in terms of better insights and faster. I have to say, when I looked at these kind of things, clearly there has been applications around that help people to do these kind of things for years. So I'm not saying that this is a brand new thing. I think the code interpreter is brand new, and that's really, really exciting. But I guess that's why in my 2x2 earlier, when I talked about the consumers versus the business, this stuff in terms of value to the customers, that's been around for some time. It's the business side where I think the value is going to really be. So fundamentally, we are talking about the end of the best, as in it's not a matter of kind of being the best person in X. What generative AI allows you to do is to be the only person who is able to do X. There was a great article called 1,000 True Fans, written by a guy called Kevin Kelly in 2009. And essentially what he said was, you could build a really good business by finding 1,000 people in the world on the internet who will pay you $1,000 every month, or sorry, $100 every month, and for whatever you're producing, right? And he was talking specifically about artists, but it could be anything, and that's a business for 100,000 a year. Generative AI allows you to do something very similar, which means that you can find a niche that becomes something that only you do, and generative AI can help you to service that niche. Mediocrity is actually what AI does really well, the stuff right in the middle. The value add on the right-hand side is where humans rule, but only for the moment. So back to key messages. Generative AI changes the way we work at fundamental level. Generative AI should lead to better accountants if the accountants are using it in the right way, but there's nothing to say that you will. And lastly, there really are significant opportunities available to early adopters, but it's a matter of kind of getting out there, whether it's building the apps. You know, the typewriter is not going to write itself. Actually, bad metaphor. Generative AI actually is going to write itself, but you know what I mean. So 4 key questions. What is the best way to monetize in this new world? Because there's something that AI is really good at, is helping everybody to productize what they do. So what does that mean for the way that you monetize your business right now? What can you productize? What is it that you do on a regular basis that you could train a generative AI model to do for you and for your customers? And what does that then mean for your ability to scale? Does that mean that you could go into other locations, other businesses, because you've got that ability to productize? And then lastly, What can you and AI now do together that you couldn't do before? Because it's not cheating. So something that we can help you with at Stone and Chalk, we do strategic workshops which help businesses like yours to leverage that tech disruption to understand the answers to those questions that I posed earlier. We offer AI training series to businesses. Think of this as the trailer, not the film. So just imagine what the film's like. And then lastly, we have access to a large number of startups who are building businesses in this space and other spaces. And so if you are interested in disrupting your own industry or wanting to know more about those startups, please get in touch. And that's it. Oh, yep, 50 minutes again. So questions and answers. Let me open this. So firstly, from Tim Thurlin, CANZ.WA, will Microsoft automatically embed GPT in all its applications, Outlook, Excel, Word, etc.? If so, does that mean we won't need to go into ChatGPT as a standalone app? I believe that's exactly what they want to do. And I suspect that what they're wanting to do also is to kind of launch new applications that they're not necessarily in at the moment, which will also embed, because if they weren't to do that, that would be very skeuomorphic. Interestingly, I heard the other day that Bing has increased its total share of search by 0.25%, which seems a really expensive way. If they've spent 10 billion on OpenAI, that's a really expensive way to get 0.25%. You mentioned legal and accounting as two fields of knowledge, and there are frequent references to medicine. What is your view about what fields, domains are leading the adoption of AI, and specifically generative AI? And is there research available on which domains have the most potential versus where is it being leveraged already, etc.? Specifically looking at the domain of management consulting, but a broad view would also be appreciated. Don't ask small questions. I would say that it's rather frustratingly, it's a really, really early time at the moment. We have been surprised at how few people are really kind of moving forward with generative AI products. So I don't think there's anyone beyond the large tech firms who are coming out with some really cool stuff. I think there's one of my favorite videos, a TED Talk by a guy called Sal Khan, Khan, and he talks about the way in which the Khan Academy has applied AI, and that does look genuinely like magic. It means that I'm really reluctant to spend money on my children's education. So I think I wouldn't identify any one field or domain because I think it's really, really early. But certainly the way that people are talking is really exciting. In terms of management consulting, I think a lot that I've talked about today in terms of accounting and professional services probably applies to management consulting too, but we could help with that. So give me a call. Re the plugins that go into other databases. How can I control the monetizing of a plugin? Looking up my database, is there a way to create a version called ChatGPT for my registered customers only? That's a really great question. And I think everybody who's creating plugins right now or is thinking about it is asking themselves that. I don't believe there is a way to do that right now. But I think it has to be on its way if ChatGPT are going to kind of monetize this in the way that they really could. Is data up to date and real time? Well, that depends. I believe if you were to use something like Google Bard and Bing Chat, it is, although I've had some bad experiences with Bing Chat, as in it's not particularly up to date. But with ChatGPT, there is a browser plugin that's still in beta, but you can kind of tick it, and then it's given access to the live internet. Again, that's still a bit buggy, which I guess is why it's in beta. But you're not restricted to just data up to September 21 anymore, unless you're not paying for the subscription. And I think that's it for Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ben. That was a fantastic insight and lesson on reshaping the future of accounting with ChatGPT and AI. Again, if you want to learn more about how Stone and Chalk can help you or your accounting firm embrace ChatGPT and AI, please email kim.jolly@stoneandchalk.com.au. We would absolutely love to help you and your firm. That's it. Thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to joining our next Stone and Chalk event soon. Thank you very much.